The wind on the plains has a lonesome cry, a sound that mirrored the emptiness in Paloma's soul. She was a woman adrift with no husband, no home, and no help in a land that swallowed the weak. They called it the land of opportunity, but for a lone woman, it was a slow, grinding death. Then he appeared a silhouette against the blood-red sunset, a lone cowboy named Andrew, who looked at her, not with pity but with a strange, unnerving claim in his eyes. This isn't a story of a simple rescue. It's a tale of how a lifeline can become a noose. The dust was a relentless thief. It stole the moisture from Paloma's lips, the hope from her heart, and the last of the green from the parched earth around her. Her covered wagon, once a vessel of dreams, now stood as a tombstone for a life that had died before it had truly begun. 3 months. 3 months since her husband, Thomas, had succumbed to the fever, leaving her with nothing but a half-finished sod house, a lame mule, and a stack of debts in the burgeoning town of Redemption, a name that now felt like a cruel joke. Redemption, Kansas. It was supposed to be their Eden. Thomas had filled her head with promises of fertile land, a sky so vast it would humble a king, and a future built with their own 2 hands. He'd painted a picture of a life far from the grime and poverty of their tenement in St. Louis. But the reality was a harsh, unforgiving canvas of brown and grey. The sun was a tyrant, the rain a fickle friend, and the wind a constant, maddening whisper of failure. Today, that whisper had become a roar. Mr. David Croft, the town's banker, and a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, had paid her a visit. He hadn't even bothered to dismount his gleaming black stallion, a creature as sleek and predatory as its owner. From his elevated position, he'd looked down at Paloma, at the threadbare state of her dress, at the desperation etched on her face, and he had delivered his verdict. "The note is due, Mrs. Jennings," he'd said, his voice smooth as polished stone. Thomas was a good man, a dreamer. But dreams don't pay for lumber and seed. Paloma had pleaded, her voice cracking with the dust and despair. She'd asked for more time, for a chance to prove she could work the land, to make good on her husband's promises. Croft had simply shaken his head, a gesture of finality that sent a chill down her spine despite the blistering heat. "The bank is not a charitable institution. You have until the end of the week. Then this land, what little there is of it, will be forfeit." The end of the week. It was a death sentence. Without the land, she had nothing. She would be forced to seek work in town, and she knew what kind of work was available for a woman alone. A woman without a husband's protection. The thought made her stomach churn with a mixture of fear and revulsion. The saloon girls, with their painted faces and hollow laughter, were a constant reminder of the fate that awaited women who fell on hard times. As Croft rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake, a new sound pierced the air. The low, mournful bray of her mule Jasper. The poor creature was in a bad way. A snake bite to the leg a week ago had left it swollen and festering. She had tried everything she knew, poultices of herbs and desperate prayers, but the infection was winning. Jasper was her only means of transport, her only hope of ever leaving this forsaken place, if it came to that. Tears she had refused to shed in front of Croft now streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She sank to her knees, the rough, dry earth scraping her skin. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. The vast open prairie that had once seemed so full of promise now felt like the walls of a prison closing in on her with each passing moment. It was in this moment of absolute desolation that she first saw him. A lone rider emerging from the shimmering heat haze on the horizon. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, not like a man in a hurry, but like a man who owned the very land he traveled upon. As he drew closer, she could make out the details. A wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, a dusty duster that fell to his ankles, and a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He rode a powerful roan, a horse that looked as if it had been born of the rugged landscape itself. Fear, sharp and primal, shot through her. A lone woman was a vulnerable target. She scrambled to her feet, her hand instinctively going to the small, cold comfort of the pocket knife she kept tied to her apron. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. The rider stopped a respectful distance from her, his gaze taking in the scene before him. The dilapidated wagon, the half-finished soddy, the lame mule, and the woman who stood like a cornered animal ready to fight for her life. He dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. He was tall, leaner than Thomas had been, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from sun-beaten leather. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were what held her captive. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that held a hint of a sadness that mirrored her own. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air. He removed his hat, revealing a thick mane of dark, unruly hair. It was a gesture of respect, but it did little to quell the frantic beating of her heart. "What do you want?" Paloma asked, her voice barely a whisper. She cursed her own weakness, the tremor she couldn't control. "Saw your mule," he said, his gaze shifting to Jasper. "Looks like he's in a bad way." He took a step closer, and Paloma flinched. He stopped immediately, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "I mean no harm, ma'am. I've got some experience with livestock. Might be I can help." Help. The word was a foreign concept, a kindness she had forgotten existed. She looked at the stranger, at the earnestness in his storm-grey eyes, and a sliver of her carefully constructed wall of distrust began to crumble. What did she have to lose? Jasper was dying anyway. "The leg," she said, her voice still trembling. "A snake bite." He nodded, his gaze assessing the swollen, discolored limb. He walked slowly around the mule, his movements calm and reassuring. Jasper, who had been agitated and in pain, seemed to quiet under his steady presence. The stranger ran a gentle hand down the mule's neck, murmuring soft words that Paloma couldn't quite hear. Then he turned back to her. "I have a poultice in my saddlebags. It's a remedy my grandmother taught me. Strong stuff. It might help, but it's gonna hurt him some." Paloma looked at her dying mule, then back at the stranger. A glimmer of hope, fragile and tentative, flickered within her. "Do it," she said. For the next hour she watched as the man who introduced himself as Andrew worked with a skill and tenderness that surprised her. He lanced the wound with a sharp, clean knife, his hands steady and sure. Jasper brayed in pain, but Andrew's calm voice and firm touch seemed to soothe the animal. He applied the foul-smelling poultice, a thick, dark paste, and then wrapped the leg in clean strips of cloth he produced from his own supplies. When he was finished, he stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "He'll need to be kept quiet. The fever might get worse before it gets better. But he's got a fighting chance." A fighting chance. It was more than she had dared to hope for. Tears of gratitude welled in her eyes, blurring the image of the man before her. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Andrew looked at her, his expression unreadable. "A cup of coffee would be a fair start," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time. As she bustled around her meager campfire, her hands shaking as she measured out the precious coffee grounds, she couldn't shake the feeling that this man's arrival was more than just a coincidence. There was an intensity in his gaze, a possessiveness in the way he looked at her, that both frightened and intrigued her. They drank their coffee in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the vast, empty hum of the prairie. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. In the fading light, the harshness of the landscape softened, and for the first time in a long time, Paloma felt a flicker of something other than despair. But as darkness fell, a new kind of fear began to creep in. The prairie was a dangerous place at night. Coyotes, wolves, and worse roamed the land, and here she was, alone with a stranger, a man who had appeared out of nowhere and who looked at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You shouldn't be out here alone, ma'am," Andrew said, his voice low and serious. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his words sent a jolt of both terror and a strange, unwelcome relief through her. "I'll stay the night," he said. It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a statement of fact. "I'll keep watch." Paloma opened her mouth to protest, to tell him that she was fine, that she didn't need his protection. But the words died in her throat. The truth was, she was terrified. The thought of being alone in the dark with the coyotes, howling in the distance, was more than she could bear. And so she nodded a silent, reluctant acceptance. As she retreated to the relative safety of her wagon, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a deal with the devil, or perhaps with a saint. In this God-forsaken land, it was getting harder and harder to tell the difference. Andrew sat by the fire, his back to her, a solitary figure against the vast, star-strewn canvas of the night sky. He seemed as much a part of the wilderness as the wind and the stars. He was a mystery, a paradox of kindness and a barely concealed danger. As Paloma lay in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic crackle of the fire and the occasional soft stamp of the horses, she knew that her life had taken a turn. The arrival of Andrew was a stone thrown into the still stagnant pool of her despair, and she had no way of knowing if the ripples he created would lead to her salvation or her damnation. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something other than the crushing weight of hopelessness. She felt a sliver of anticipation, a terrifying, exhilarating sense of the unknown. And in the heart of the wild, untamed West, sometimes the unknown was all a person had left to cling to. The night was long and filled with the unfamiliar sounds of a shared solitude. Paloma, cocooned in the musty darkness of her wagon, found sleep to be a skittish creature, easily startled. Every snap of a twig, every distant howl of a coyote, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. Yet beneath the fear, there was a strange and unfamiliar sense of security. The steady presence of Andrew, a silent sentinel by the fire, was a bulwark against the encroaching darkness. He had not asked for anything, had not made any untoward advances. He had simply stated his intention to stay, and in doing so had erected an invisible shield around her small, vulnerable camp. She rose at dawn, the ski a canvas of soft pinks and pale blues. Peeking through the wagon's canvas flap, She saw Andrew already awake, tending to the fire. He moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a life lived outdoors, a man at home in the wilderness. He had already checked on Jasper, and from the gentle way he ran a hand down the mule's neck, Paloma could tell he was a man who cared for animals. When she emerged from the wagon, a cup of coffee was waiting for her. It was a small gesture, but in her world where kindness had become a forgotten luxury, it felt like a grand offering. "Mornin', ma'am," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. He nodded towards Jasper. "The swelling's gone down some. The fever's still there, but he's a fighter." Paloma's heart swelled with a gratitude so intense it almost brought her to tears. I can't thank you enough, mister." She trailed off, realizing she didn't even know his last name. "Just Andrew is fine," he said, his gaze meeting hers over the rim of his coffee cup. "And you're Mrs. Jennings?" She nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Paloma." The name hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge connecting two solitary souls. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable but filled with a quiet understanding. They were two strangers, thrown together by circumstance, their pasts shrouded in mystery. The day passed in a blur of shared tasks. Andrew, with a strength that seemed effortless, helped her reinforce the walls of the half-finished soddy. He showed her how to mix the mud and straw to create a more durable plaster, his hands guiding hers with a gentle patience. Paloma, in turn, shared what little food she had, a meager meal of cornbread and dried beans. It was a simple domestic scene, one that felt both strangely familiar and achingly foreign. It was the life she had dreamed of with Thomas, a life of shared labor and quiet companionship. But this man was not Thomas. Thomas had been a dreamer, a man of words and grand plans. Andrew was a man of action, of few words, but profound deeds. As they worked, Paloma found herself stealing glances at him. He was a man of contrasts. His hands, though calloused and rough, were capable of such gentle care. His face, weathered and hard, would soften when he looked at Jasper. And his eyes, those stormy grey eyes, held a depth of sadness that hinted at a past as troubled as her own. She learned little about him. He spoke in clipped sentences his past, a locked door to which she had no key. He was from Texas, he'd said, and had been a cowboy for as long as he could remember. He was heading north, though he didn't say where or why. He was a man who seemed to exist only in the present, his future as unwritten as the vast, empty plains that stretched before them. The next day, as the sun reached its zenith, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of visitors. Paloma's heart clenched with fear. It was Croft, the banker, and with him were two other men, their faces hard and unyielding. They rode up to the camp, their horses kicking up dust that settled on everything, a fresh layer of grime on Paloma's already bleak world. Croft's eyes, cold and calculating, took in the scene before him. He noted the progress on the soddy, the presence of Andrew, and the slow but steady recovery of the mule. A flicker of something, annoyance, suspicion, crossed his face. "Mrs. Jennings," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I see you have company." He looked at Andrew, his gaze lingering on the rifle that was never far from the cowboy's side. "This is Mr. Andrew Paloma," said her voice, trembling slightly. "He's been kind enough to help me." Croft's smile was a thin, predatory slash across his face. "How neighborly. But I'm afraid his help will be for naught. The end of the week is tomorrow. The land is forfeit." Paloma's fragile hope, so carefully nurtured over the past 2 days, shattered into a million pieces. She looked at Croft at the smug satisfaction on his face, and a wave of helpless anger washed over her. But before she could speak, Andrew stepped forward. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, placing himself between Paloma and the banker. He was not a large man, but he possessed an aura of quiet authority that seemed to command respect. "The lady needs more time," Andrew said, his voice low and even, but with an undercurrent of steel that made the hairs on Paloma's arms stand on end. Croft's eyes narrowed. "And who are you to be making such demands?" "Her new husband." He sneered the words, a deliberate insult. Paloma's face burned with humiliation. She opened her mouth to deny it, to put an end to the vile insinuation. But Andrew spoke first. His words, when they came, were so shocking, so unexpected, that they seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the shimmering heat. As a matter of fact, Andrew said, his voice as calm and steady as a prairie river I am. A collective gasp went through the small group. Croft's jaw dropped, his smug expression replaced by one of stunned disbelief. Paloma stared at Andrew, her mind reeling. Had he truly just said what she thought he'd said? You're married," Croft stammered, his composure momentarily shattered. Andrew didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "We were married by a traveling preacher a few days ago. We just haven't had the chance to file the paperwork in town yet." It was a lie, a bold, audacious lie. But it was delivered with such conviction that even Paloma almost believed it. Croft, recovering his composure, narrowed his eyes. "I find that hard to believe. A woman like Mrs. Jennings marrying a drifter." The word was laced with contempt. Andrew's hand, which had been resting on his hip, moved ever so slightly closer to the butt of his gun. "You can believe what you want," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But this is my wife, and this is my land, and I'll thank you to be on your way." The threat, though unspoken, was clear. The air crackled with tension. For a long, heart-stopping moment, no one moved. Then Croft, after a final scathing glare at Paloma, seemed to make a decision. With a curt nod to his men, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and unanswered questions in his wake. Paloma stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a strange, exhilarating sense of relief. She looked at Andrew, at the man who had just claimed her as his own, a man she barely knew, and 1,000 questions swirled in her mind. Why had he done it? What did he want from her? And what in God's name was going to happen now? As the dust settled, so too did a new reality. Paloma was no longer just a widow, a woman alone and adrift. She was, in the eyes of the world, a married woman. And her husband was a man of mystery, a man with a past he wouldn't share, and a future he hadn't planned. The fragile alliance they had forged over the past 2 days had just been sealed with a lie that had saved her from ruin, but had also bound her to a stranger in a way she could never have imagined. As she looked at Andrew, at the unreadable expression in his stormy grey eyes, she knew that her life had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The lone cowboy had not just saved her from the wolves at her door. He had invited a new unknown predator into her life, and she had no choice but to let him in. The dust from Croft's departure settled slowly, each particle seeming to add another layer to the oppressive silence. The vast prairie, which moments before had felt like a prison, now felt like an empty stage after a brutal play had reached its climax. The only sound was the frantic feathered beat of Paloma's own heart. She stared at Andrew, who stood with his back to her, looking out over the plains as if searching for an answer in the heat-shimmered horizon. The lie he had told was not a whisper. It was a physical presence between them, a third entity born of desperation and danger. It was a shield, yes, but it felt to Paloma like the four walls of a cage being built around her. He had saved her from Croft, but what had he saved her for? Why? The word was a dry rasp in her throat, small and fragile against the immense quiet. She had to ask, had to understand the mind of the man who had just claimed her life with a single audacious falsehood. Andrew didn't turn around for a long moment. When he finally did, the storm in his grey eyes had subsided, replaced by a grim, weary resignation. I've seen men like David Croft before, Paloma. More of them than I care to count. They're vultures. They circle the weak, the isolated. They see a lone woman with a piece of land they want, and they don't see a person. They see an obstacle to be removed. He wouldn't have just taken the land. He would have broken you first. His words were stark, unadorned with any attempt to soften their brutal truth. He spoke of a world she knew existed, but had desperately tried to ignore. But to say we were married. Her voice trembled, the sacrilege of the lie warring with the undeniable relief of her salvation. It's a sin, a falsehood before God and man. It was the only falsehood he would believe. Andrew countered, his voice low and firm. It was the only thing that would make you more trouble than you were worth. A lone woman is a target. A widow is an opportunity. But a married woman has a protector. In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of men like Croft, she belongs to someone, and they are often too cowardly to risk a fight with another man when an easier target can be found. A protector. There was that word again. It echoed in the hollow spaces of her fear, a promise of safety that came at a terrifying price. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against a sudden chill. What now? He'll leave us be. Andrew's gaze was unflinching. For a time. But he's a banker, a man of details and ledgers. He'll go back to town, and he'll start wondering. He'll check the county records. When he finds no marriage certificate, he'll know I was lying. And then he'll come back, not just for the land, but for the insult. He'll bring more men, and he will be merciless. Every word was a nail, sealing her into a future she could not control. She saw the truth of it, the cold, calculating logic of a predator. So what do we do? She whispered, the last of her fight draining away. Now he said, his voice dropping, carrying the weight of an unavoidable decree. We make the lie a truth. Paloma's breath hitched. A flock of birds burst from the tall grass nearby. Their sudden flight a mirror of the panic in her chest. What do you mean? We ride into redemption tomorrow morning, he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. We go to the courthouse, we find the justice of the peace, and we become Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Cutter. Cutter. The name was as sharp and final as the blade of an axe. Andrew Cutter. It felt alien on her tongue, a name she had no right to. No, she stammered, shaking her head. We can't. We mustn't. I don't know you. You don't know me. It's a sham. It's survival, he corrected, taking a step closer. He wasn't menacing, but his presence was overwhelming, solid as an oak. What do we know? I know you're a woman of grit who's been pushed to the edge of a cliff. You know I'm a man who can stand between you and the fall. Out here, Paloma, that's more foundation than most marriages have. It's more real than the promises your Thomas made about this land, isn't it? The mention of her husband's name was a cruel but effective strike. Thomas's promises had turned to dust just like his body. Andrew offered not promises but a stark, unvarnished reality. He was offering her a shield, and the price was her name, her future, her very self. Looking into his resolute eyes, she saw the terrible truth. She had no other choice. The ride to town the next day was a silent journey into bondage. Paloma sat on the wagon seat beside Andrew, the space between them, a chasm of unspoken anxieties. She was acutely aware of his nearness, the rough fabric of his sleeve, the scent of leather and dust that clung to him. He handled the reins with an easy, competent grip, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Was he as troubled as she? Or was this just another calculated move in a life filled with them? As they reached the outskirts of redemption, heads began to turn. The news carried by Croft or his men had clearly preceded them. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their conversations to stare. Women whispered behind their hands. Paloma felt their eyes on her like a physical weight, their curiosity and judgment burning her skin. She was no longer just the poor widow Jennings. She was a spectacle, the woman who had taken up with a drifter, a gunslinger. She pulled her bonnet lower, wishing she could disappear. The courthouse was a small, grim building that smelled of stale cigar smoke and legal decay. The justice of the peace, a man named Bartholomew Smith, was portly and balding, with eyes that held the deep, unyielding boredom of a man who had seen every form of human desperation and was impressed by none of it. He peered at them over his spectacles. Cutter and Jennings. Heard you two were in a hurry. His tone was laced with a faint, mocking amusement. He mumbled through the ceremony, the words that were meant to be sacred and profound, becoming a meaningless drone. Paloma stood beside Andrew, her hand resting stiffly in his. His palm was rough and calloused, but it was also warm and surprisingly steady. When it was time to say "I do," the words caught in her throat. She felt Andrew's thumb press gently against the back of her hand, a silent, insistent pressure. She forced the words out, a choked whisper that was barely audible. The justice pronounced them man and wife and slammed his book shut with a thud of finality. A wave of dizziness washed over Paloma, so intense she thought she might faint. The dust motes dancing in the sliver of sunlight from the window seemed to spin into a vortex. It was done. The lie was now law. She was Paloma Cutter. The name felt like a costume she was forced to wear, one that would never come off. Their first weeks of marriage were a stilted, awkward dance of avoidance. They had finished the soddy, and it was a proper shelter now, sturdy and warm. But it was also a tiny, intimate space for two people who were functionally strangers. Paloma had hung a worn quilt down the center of the single room, a flimsy partition that did little to create any real privacy. In the long, dark nights, she would lie on her cot, listening to the sounds of him on the other side, the soft thud of his boots on the dirt floor, the rustle of his bedroll, the quiet, rhythmic sound of his breathing in the dark. His presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of the man whose name she now bore and the intimacy their marriage certificate demanded, but they did not share. Days were filled with shared labor and profound silence. They worked side by side in the garden, their hands often inches apart as they pulled weeds or watered the thirsty shoots. He was a tireless worker, his movements economical and effective. He never complained. He never demanded. He simply did what needed to be done. He would hunt, returning with a rabbit or a brace of quail, which he would clean and prepare with a practiced efficiency, leaving it for her to cook. They ate their meals in silence, the scraping of forks on the tin plates the only conversation. Yet slowly, tentatively, something began to shift. She noticed small things. The way he always ensured the water buckets were full before she woke. The day he found her struggling with a broken axe handle and without a word took it and fashioned a new one, its surface sanded smooth. One evening, she noticed a tear in the sleeve of his only spare shirt. While he was out checking on Jasper, she took it and mended it with small, neat stitches, leaving it folded on his bedroll. He never mentioned it, but the next time he wore it, she felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. These were the only words they had, small, unspoken acts of care that began to build a fragile bridge across the chasm of their silence. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they sat by the campfire. A comfortable silence had settled between them, a silence that was less about avoidance and more about a shared peaceful weariness, emboldened by the deepening twilight and a desperate need to understand the man she was bound to. Paloma found her voice. Andrew. She began her own voice, startling her in the quiet. He looked up from the flame he was poking with a stick, his face shadowed and unreadable. That first day, when you came here, you weren't just passing by, were you? He was still for a long time, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, as if the answer was written there. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, laced with a sorrow that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of his bones. No, he said. I was running. Running from what she whispered, leaning forward slightly. He shook his head, a gesture of deep, unshakable finality. He lifted his eyes to hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw a flicker of something that made her shiver, a raw, haunted pain. From a past that I can't outrun. From men who don't forget. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and his expression was one of profound warning. There are things you don't know about me, Paloma. Things that happened a long time ago. But the past has a long shadow, and if it finds me, it could put you in grave danger. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach, chilling the fragile warmth she had begun to feel. Before she could ask more, before she could press him for the truth, she both craved and dreaded a new sound cut through the night. The sound of an approaching horse moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Andrew was on his feet in an instant, his transformation so swift it was terrifying. The weary man was gone, replaced by the dangerous sentinel. His hand rested on the butt of his gun as a rider emerged from the darkness into the flickering circle of firelight. The man was tall and wiry, with a long, cruel scar that snaked down his left cheek. His eyes, the color of faded denim, were cold and hard. He dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the camp before settling on Andrew with a look of malicious familiarity. Evening. Andrew the stranger said, his voice a gravelly sneer. He then turned his cold eyes on Paloma. I see you've made yourself at home. Andrew stepped forward, placing himself between Paloma and the newcomer. What do you want, Caleb? he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The man named Caleb smiled a humorless baring of teeth. "Just delivering a message," he said, his eyes glinting. "From your brother. He's heard you've settled down, and he wants what's his. He wants his share of the gold." Caleb's words fell into the prairie silence, sucking the very air from Paloma's lungs. A brother. Gold. The concepts were so foreign, so violent. They seemed to belong to another world entirely. Not the fragile existence she and Andrew had painstakingly carved from the dust. Andrew's stillness was terrifying. It was the stillness of a rattler before it strikes every line of his body, coiled with a tension that was almost visible. "I told you." He repeated his voice, a low growl that vibrated with suppressed violence. "I don't have a brother." Caleb's lips, thin and chapped, pulled back from his yellowed teeth in a sneer. The long puckered scar on his cheek seemed to deepen a permanent mark of past brutalities. "You can deny your own blood, Andrew, but you can't deny the past. And David, well, David is tired of waiting. He's a man of property now, you see. A man of standing. But he ain't forgotten what you owe him. He wants his half of the haul from the Black Creek payroll." "David." The name struck Paloma with the force of a physical blow. It couldn't be. Not David Croft, the banker, the man whose predatory smile and cold eyes had haunted her waking moments. The man who held the note to her land, who had tried to ruin her. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening certainty. Croft. The name escaped her lips as a choked whisper, a question, and a dawning, terrible realization. Caleb's dead denim eyes snapped to her, and his sneer widened into a malicious grin. He looked her up and down, a slow, appraising gaze that made her feel stripped bare, violated. "So the little wife knows of him. He's done well for himself, our David. Built a respectable life on a foundation of, let's call it, shrewd investments. But he ain't forgotten his roots, and he ain't forgotten what you took from him, Andrew. He wants his due." Andrew's hand, which had been hovering near his hip, now rested firmly on the worn leather grip of his Colt. "There is no gold," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It was lost in the river during the chase. Every last ounce." "That ain't the story," I hear Caleb counted his own hand, moving casually to rest near his weapon. It was a gesture of lazy confidence, the movement of a man who enjoyed the dance of intimidation. "I hear you were real clever. Stashed it before the law closed in. And I see you ain't so alone anymore. Got yourself a home, a pretty wife." He let the words hang in the air, the threat as sharp and clear as a blade to the throat. "Lots to lose. Get off my land," Andrew said. The words were not shouted. They were spoken with a deadly quiet that was far more menacing than any roar. It was the finality of a judge passing sentence. For a long moment, the two men locked gazes. A silent battle of wills fought in the oppressive Kansas heat. Caleb finally seemed to decide this was a fight for another day. He held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. All right, I'm going. For now." He swung himself onto his horse with a practiced ease. "But you ought to know Andrew. David ain't a man who forgives or forgets. He'll be comin' for what's his. And he ain't nearly as patient as I am." With a final insolent wink in Paloma's direction, Caleb spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a swirling cloud of dust and a suffocating fear in his wake. The moment he was gone, the taut wire of tension within Andrew seemed to snap. He didn't explode in anger. He simply deflated the strength, seeming to drain out of him. He stumbled to a nearby log and sank onto it, burying his face in his hands, his broad shoulders slumping in defeat. The silent, capable protector was gone, replaced by a man drowning in his own past. Paloma stood frozen for a moment, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. But seeing him so broken stirred something else within her, a fierce protective instinct. She crossed the small distance between them and knelt in the dust before him. "Andrew," she said softly. He didn't move. She reached out her hand, hesitating for a moment before she placed it gently on his trembling shoulder. "What was he talking about? What gold, please? You have to tell me. David Croft, is he truly your brother?" He flinched at her touch, but he didn't pull away. After a long, heavy silence, he finally lifted his head. The look in his eyes was one of such profound pain and regret that it stole her breath. "He's my half-brother," he admitted, his voice hoarse and muffled. "We share a mother, different fathers, and different souls, I reckon." He began to speak, his voice low and heavy, as if he were dragging the words up from a deep, dark well of memory. He told her of a childhood spent in the shadow of his brother's burgeoning darkness, of David's insatiable greed and the cruel streak that Andrew could never understand. He spoke of his own path, of the pride he'd felt when he pinned on the star of a Texas Ranger, of his belief in the simple, stark lines between right and wrong. "I thought I'd left him behind," he murmured, his gaze lost in the distance. "But our paths were bound to cross again. There was a payroll robbery, the Black Creek payroll. It was David's gang. I was part of the posse sent to hunt them down." As he spoke, Paloma could almost see it, the frantic chase under a stormy sky, the crack of rifle fire echoing through the canyons, the smell of rain, sweat, and blood. He described the final shootout, the chaos and confusion. And then the moment that had damned him. He'd come face to face with David, who was wounded, bleeding in the mud. "He begged me," Andrew whispered, his voice cracking. "He looked at me, and for a second he was just my little brother again. He swore he was done with it all, that they'd forced him into it. He just wanted out. He begged me to help him." Torn between the badge on his chest and the blood in his veins, Andrew had made a choice. He had fired his own gun into the air, creating a diversion, and had dragged David away from the fight, hiding him in a remote line shack to wait out the search. It was a betrayal of his oath, but in that moment he believed it was an act of salvation. "I left him with food and water," he continued, a bitter, self-mocking laugh escaping his lips. "I told him to wait for me. I was going to come back, take him somewhere far away, where he could start over. When I returned 2 days later, he was gone, and so was the gold his gang had stashed in the floorboards. He'd played me. He took the gold and vanished, leaving me to face the posse." The rest of the story came out in ragged pieces. He was branded a traitor, a coward, an accomplice. He lost everything that had ever mattered to him, his badge, his reputation, his good name, his home. He had been running ever since a ghost haunted by the shadow of his brother's betrayal. "I never saw the gold again," he finished, his voice hollow. "I figured David took it all, but he must believe I double-crossed him, that I went back and took it for myself before he could. Because he's a liar and a thief, and that's the only way his mind can work. He can't imagine anyone acting out of anything but greed." Paloma listened, her heart aching with a profound empathy that erased her own fear. This man, this stranger who had saved her, was not a drifter or a gunslinger. He was a good man who had been broken on the anvil of his own compassion. The lie that bound them together suddenly felt insignificant compared to the truth of his suffering. A new resolve hardened within her. She would not be a victim. She would not let this ghost from his past destroy the fragile home they had built. This land was hers. This life was hers. And this man, whatever the circumstances of their union, was her husband. In the days that followed, a grim purpose settled over the homestead. The air was thick with unspoken fear, but it was also charged with a shared determination. Andrew taught Paloma to shoot. He placed the heavy Winchester rifle in her hands, showing her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to line up the sights, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. His touch was brief, professional, yet a current of trust passed between them. The weight of the rifle felt solid, real a counterpoint to the nebulous fear that surrounded them. The sharp kick against her shoulder, the acrid smell of burnt powder, the satisfying thud as her bullets hit the cottonwood tree they used for a target. It all became a ritual, a prayer against the coming darkness. They worked together, fortifying the soddy, their movements economical and synchronized. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a space. They were partners, a unit forged in the heat of a shared threat. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, the silence between them no longer awkward, but a comfortable blanket of understanding. A look across the flames, a shared glance at the darkening horizon spoke volumes. The storm broke on a hot, windless afternoon, the kind of day where the air itself feels heavy waiting. Paloma saw the dust cloud first, a rising plume on the horizon. There was no doubt who it was. David Croft rode at the head of the posse, not on his sleek banker's stallion, but on a powerful warhorse, a rifle resting across his saddle. With him were Caleb and a half-dozen other men, their faces a gallery of cruelty and greed. Andrew and Paloma were ready. They were inside the soddy, the windows barricaded, their rifles loaded. Andrew David's voice boomed across the prairie. It was the same smooth voice he used with his banking customers, but now it was layered with a triumphant cruelty. "It's been a long time," little brother Andrew appeared in the doorway, a rifle in his hand. "Not long enough, David." David laughed, a sound that held no humor, only malice. "I've come for what's mine, the gold, and a little bit of payback for all my trouble." "There is no gold," Andrew said, his voice as steady and hard as the land itself. "You always were a bad liar," David sneered. "Now you can walk out of there and give me what's mine, and I might let your little wife live, or I can burn you both out." His gaze swept over the soddy, a brutal promise in his eyes. The standoff stretched. The sun beat down, turning the prairie into a shimmering furnace. Then the first shot rang out. But it didn't come from David's men, nor from the soddy. It came from a small, rocky rise to the south, a place that overlooked the entire homestead. One of David's men cried out and toppled from his saddle. Chaos erupted. David's men, caught completely by surprise, wheeled their horses around, firing blindly toward the rise. "It's a trap," Caleb yelled. Andrew seized the moment. His rifle cracked, and another of David's men fell. Inside Paloma, her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard she could barely breathe, lifted the Winchester. Her world narrowed to the V of the rifle sight. She found a target, a man aiming at their doorway, and squeezed the trigger. The kick was jarring, the sound deafening, but she saw the man flinch and fall back. The battle was a short, terrifying whirlwind of noise and smoke. The mysterious marksman on the rise was devastatingly effective. his shots finding their marks with chilling precision. David, his face a mask of apoplectic fury, saw his posse disintegrating around him. With a curse, he spurred his horse in a desperate attempt to flee. He didn't get 20 yards. A single sharp report from the rise, and David was thrown from his saddle as if by an invisible hand. He hit the ground and didn't move. A profound silence fell, broken only by the groans of a wounded man and the lonely cry of the wind sweeping across the prairie. The air tasted of gun smoke and death. The lone rider began to make his way down from the rise. Andrew, still standing in the doorway, watched his approach, his body rigid. "It can't be," he breathed the words laced with a disbelief so profound it bordered on reverence. The stranger dismounted, his movements carrying a familiar, easy grace. He was older, his face deeply lined by the sun and time, but as he pushed back the brim of his hat, Paloma saw the face from the faded photograph. Andrew kept tucked away the face of his Texas Ranger partner, the man he thought had died at Black Creek. Ben Andrews' voice was a choked, incredulous whisper. The man Ben offered a slow, weary smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes, which were filled with the ghosts of a shared past. "Hello, Andrew," he said, his voice raspy. "It's been a long time." His gaze moved from Andrew to Paloma, then to the carnage staining the ground. "Looks like I got here just in time." He turned back to Andrew, the weight of years of unspoken history passing between them. "I have something that belongs to you," he said. Reaching into his saddlebag, he pulled out a heavy oilskin-wrapped pouch. He tossed it through the air. Andrew caught it instinctively. It landed in his hands with a dull, heavy, metallic thud. The unmistakable sound of gold. Andrew stared at the pouch, then at Ben, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible. The gold, the source of all his misery, was here, and the man who had delivered it was a ghost from his past. The story of Andrew and Paloma, a story born of desperation and forged in the crucible of the Wild West, had taken another unexpected turn. Their future, once as barren as the plains around them, now held the promise of a new beginning. A beginning bought with blood and second chances. But in a land where ghosts walk and fortunes are made and lost in the blink of an eye, is any future truly secure? What happened to the gold? And what new challenges will Paloma and Andrew face in a world that is anything but black and white? The answers to these questions are a story for another day, a story that we will tell if you'll have us. So if you want to know what happens next in the saga of the lone cowboy and the woman he claimed as his own, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss what's coming. The West is a wild, unpredictable place, and the best stories are yet to be told.